Hi again. We are going to talk about the brain blood vessels. Arterial supply to the encephalon comes from three main arteries. One is the basilar artery, and the other two are the internal carotid arteries, the right and the left. These three arteries, once they enter the cranial cavity, they are going to form what is named the Circulus Arteriosus Cerebri, or Willis polygon. And from this circle, arteries are going to branch off and vascularize the different parts of the encephalon. So from the internal carotid artery up to the basilar artery, this connection, it is called the Caudal communicating artery, and that is on both sides. It's a pair structure. From this caudal communicating artery branch off the left caudal cerebral artery and the left rostral cerebellar artery on both sides. Branching from the last portion of the internal carotid artery or from the artery that comes from the left internal carotid artery and the right as well, that is the rostral cerebral artery, branch off the middle cerebral artery here. Then the continuation is the rostral cerebral artery. This rostral cerebral artery gives rise to the internal ophthalmic artery and the internal ethmoidal artery. Both rostral cerebral arteries are communicated. There are communications in between them. They are called the rostral communicating artery. And the rostral cerebral artery continues rostrodorsally to vascularize different parts of the cerebrum. Then from the basilar artery branch off pontine and labyrinthine arteries, and caudally the caudal cerebellar artery. Here on the top left you have an MRI, is a sagittal section, and it is to identify the common carotid artery that divides in the internal carotid artery that's going to enter the cranium and the external carotid artery. We identify the lingual artery, one of these branches. And as you see, the internal carotid artery, this is a ventral view of the cranium of a dog, and you see the common carotid artery here that divides in the external carotid artery and the internal carotid artery that enters through the tympanoccipital fissure in order to go through the carotid foramen. This internal carotid artery appears at the carotid foramen, and then there it is joined by the ascending pharyngeal artery that is a branch of the external carotid artery. In this image, it is very easy to identify the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri of a dog, right? And the yellow arrows are marking the internal carotid artery as it gets inside the cranial cavity and reaches the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri. This corrosion cast will show you the internal carotid artery as it goes inside, and once inside, after going through the carotid canal, it appears through the carotid foramen inside the cranial cavity. Again, in this image is a close-up and a ventral view. This is the bulla tympanica, the basioccipital bone, right? And then as you see the internal carotid artery entering the tympanoccipital fissure in order to travel through the carotid canal. And the yellow arrow is marking the ascending pharyngeal artery, and as you see, joins the internal carotid artery as this artery appears through the carotid foramen. And remember, the ascending pharyngeal artery is a branch of the external carotid artery. So in this video, it's quite easy to identify as the internal carotid artery enters through the tympano-occipital fissure and then has traveled through the carotid canal in order to appear at the carotid foramen. So this angiography shows us the internal carotid artery that at this point is traveling through the carotid canal. Here at this arrow we have the carotid foramen, so it makes a loop, receives the ascending pharyngeal artery, and then goes back inside the cranial cavity and reaches the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri. Here it is the hypophysis. Look at the dissection image, you see the hypophysis, and this is the internal carotid artery that has been sectioned at the level of the carotid foramen and goes around laterally to the hypophysis. So it has a ventral situation. It is located quite ventral in the paracellar region. So here we have to compare dog with a cat. Here is his transverse section on MRI as well as here on the image on the right. So we will focus on the image on the left first. We identify the basio-occipital bone, right? This is the brain stem, right? Cerebral hemispheres, the bulla tympanica here, so the middle ear, and this foramen here corresponds to the ventral petrossal sinus. This is for a sinus, a venous sinus of the dura mater. So this one here is the one, this one here is the one we are going to focus on. It is the carotid canal. Which structures are traveling here? The internal carotid artery that is running with postganglionic sympathetic nerve fibers coming from the cranial cervical ganglia. But we will study that in another lesson about the autonomous nervous system. So in here, as you see in the cat, this artery, the internal carotid artery, obliterates. So there is not a carotid canal. We do not see the carotid canal. What we see, identify, is the ventral petrossal sinus in the Petrovascular canal here. So we have a sinus, the ventral petrossal sinus in the Petrovascular canal, but there is not carotid canal. Okay, let's try to identify here. We are running from caudal to rostral. Here is the common carotid artery. We run rostral, and now we identify something that has appeared, has detached from the internal carotid artery. See? Go back and detaches. This structure, the common carotid artery, and this structure is the internal carotid artery that has detached from the common carotid artery. Now, this is external carotid artery. Now, so we go, and as you see, this internal carotid artery goes dorsally. And now from the external carotid artery, the lingual artery has detached here. So as we see, this internal carotid artery, now we will focus on the internal carotid artery, is going to get inside through the tympano-occipital fissure and goes running in order to enter the cranial cavity. You see? Now we are at the level of the carotid canal. This is the bulla tympanica. So we are at the level of the carotid canal. This is the internal carotid artery. And then the internal carotid artery progresses. Okay. So this is a dissection. We are we are in the process of removing the encephalon from the cranial cavity, but we identify the olfactory bulbs, the olfactory peduncle, piriform lobe here, frontal cortex, and we see these are the internal carotid arteries. As you see the internal carotid arteries, they travel vertically in order to reach the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri, and they are closely related with the hypophysis. This is the case of a cat. I said that in the cat, the internal carotid artery obliterates. However, we can identify the external portion and an internal portion as well. Look, the common carotid artery branches the occipito-ascending pharyngeal artery that gives rise to the ascending pharyngeal artery and the occipital artery, and a branch of the occipital artery is the one that is the internal carotid artery that is going to enter through the tympanoccipital fissure. Okay, so in this video, I want to focus in this artery, that is the internal carotid artery as a branch of the occipital artery. And this is the ascending pharyngeal artery. Both occipital and ascending pharyngeal arteries are branches of the occipito-ascending pharyngeal artery. And as you see, this is the internal carotid artery that is traveling to the tympanoccipital fissure. And as you see there, okay, then it obliterates and doesn't run in any carotid canal because the carotid canal does not exist in the cat. But there is an internal carotid artery inside the cranial cavity in the cat. And this internal carotid artery has formed from branches from the rete mirabili that are in the maxillary artery. And these branches enter through the orbital fissure. So again, in the cat, you have the rete mirabili and branches that are entering here through the orbital fissure in order to form the internal carotid artery in the cat inside the cranial cavity. As you see here, this is the basilar artery, right? And then you have the internal carotid artery that has formed here from the ascending pharyngeal artery that enters the carotid foramen. And it forms the internal carotid artery that receives branches from the rete mirabili through the orbital fissure. Also, some branches are supplied by the middle meningeal artery, that is this one here, that comes from the maxillary artery and enters through the oval foramen. So again, in the cat, remember, there is an internal carotid artery, and this formed here at the level of the carotid foramen by the ascending pharyngeal artery. This arrow marks the site where the carotid foramen is located in a cat. Again, in this paper, this is a very nice paper, and they are showing us the internal carotid artery in a cat. Here is a corrosion cast, and as this corrosion cast is viewed from dorsal to ventral, dorsally, so it's difficult to identify the internal carotid artery, but this internal carotid artery is located here. So this is the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri of a cat with the basilar artery. Okay. So again, in a cat, this is the aspect of the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri. Is slightly different from the one of a dog. So as you see, this image here, you have it in the corrosion cast. This is the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri that has this sigmoid shape. And an artery is going to branch off from this level, right? From the level where the internal carotid artery meets the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri. And this artery here, this artery is the middle cerebral artery. Again, we go back to this paper, and what do we see? We see that the internal carotid artery is formed by, this is the internal carotid, is formed by arteries that coming from the rete mirabile through the orbital fissure. It also receives from the middle meningeal artery and from the primitive internal carotid artery that has been formed by the ascending pharyngeal artery. The ascending pharyngeal artery is the one that takes blood from the common carotid artery inside the cranial cavity. So in the cat, there is internal carotid artery. The thing that has disappeared is the internal carotid artery inside the carotid canal, because there is not carotid canal in the cat, okay? Because the internal carotid artery, this portion obliterates. So again, we see an MRIs and we compare the MRIs with dissections. We see in the case of a dog, this is the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri. These black dots correspond to the internal carotid artery. As you see, the internal carotid artery now, once it gets this location, runs vertically. So we see this dot, these black dots here. So the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri, the hypophysis located there, and some arteries branching off from the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri. The cranial cerebellar or rostral cerebellar artery and the caudal cerebral artery. These are these ones here. The rostral cerebellar, this is wrong, we shouldn't say cranial, it's rostral cerebellar and caudal cerebral artery. Again, we are going to compare the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri with this image. Okay, we have now branching off the middle cerebral artery, the middle cerebral artery here. And we have the caudal cerebral artery, the caudal cerebral artery and the rostral, shouldn't say cranial, rostral cerebellar artery, okay? And we do not identify the basilar artery. Why so? Why it is so? We don't see the basilar artery as we identify clearly in dissections. And the thing is because cats, sheep, and pigs, the basilar artery carries blood away from the circle of Willis. Okay? So if instead of being a dog, it would have been a cat, we would be able to identify the basilar artery. Another important feature, this is the oculomotor nerve. And the oculomotor nerve is located between these two arteries, these ones here, between the caudal cerebral artery and the rostral cerebellar artery. Okay, now we have explained why this basilar artery cannot be identified in an angiography. However, it's very easy to identify the basilar artery when we perform MRIs. Remember, the cat has this basilar artery as well. So we continue focusing in this region. So we see the internal carotid arteries, and this artery that runs rostrally is the internal ophthalmic artery that runs parallel to the optic nerves. We will see this artery in other images. And here, branching from the end of the internal carotid artery, or from the beginning of the rostral cerebral artery, is the middle cerebellar artery. Here you have the internal carotid artery running vertically, the caudal communicating artery of the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri, the basilar artery, the rostral cerebellar here, and the caudal cerebral, and the oculomotor nerve running between the rostral cerebellar and caudal cerebral arteries. And this is part of this middle cerebral artery. On transverse sections, we see here we identify the rostral cerebral, because the rostral cerebral arteries are running rostodorsally. They go surrounding the corpus callosum, They go rostral to the telencephalic septum. This is the pars pellucida, pars compacta. This is the rostral commissure, right? The interthalamic adhesion, the columns of the fornix, and the hypophysis, right? Presphenoid bone, basseous sphenoid bone, the dorsum cellae, right? And the mammillary body. So now we are located here. So we see the rostral cerebral artery running in close contact with the corpus callosum. So as it goes rostrally, can be identified at this level in the presphenoid bone. And here you see these are the optic nerves, presphenoid bone with the orbital fissure, and this black dot corresponds to the internal ophthalmic artery. We have seen that it runs parallel to the optic nerves. Okay, and then in this image is from a dissection. As you see, the rostral cerebral artery goes up, rostral to the telencephalic septum, goes around the corpus callosum, branching off arteries, and anastomosis with the caudal cerebral artery. And again, here, as you see, this rostral cerebral artery forms a couple of, sometimes even more, branches that are communicated, the left ones with the right ones. So, and as you see, this is the rostral cerebral artery branching off some arteries that are going to vascularize the cerebrum, and in particular, the rostral cerebral artery vascularizes, that we'll see later, the middle portion of the 2/3 of the cerebral hemisphere, and continues an anastomosis with the caudal cerebral artery. If we make a transverse section, here we have the corpus callosum, cingulate gyri here, and the coated nucleus, the fornix right here, the lateral ventricles, and in here, in the longitudinal fissure of the cerebrum, we identify 3 vessels. The one in the middle here corresponds to the vein of the corpus callosum, because it's an impaired vein. And dorsally, we have 2 vessels. These are the rostral cerebral arteries here that had been sectioned transversely. Okay, so we have the vein of the corpus callosum and the right and left rostral cerebral arteries. And as you see in this video, you see the rostral cerebral artery is this one here. As you see, it branches off small arteries to the cerebrum, goes on top of the corpus callosum, and anastomosis with the caudal cerebral artery. So here it is to show you this rostral cerebral artery as it goes caudally on top of the corpus callosum, and anastomosis with the caudal cerebral artery that is located at this level, the level of the corpus callosum, at the splenium of the corpus callosum. Look how nice can we identify the basilar artery. Again, we continue with this rostral cerebral artery. Is this one here that is, as you see, sometimes it divides in small arteries. And as you see in this image, you see this is, we have partially sectioned the encephalon at the midplane. We have split the corpus callosum. We have split the thalami, both thalami, cutting at the level of the interthalamic adhesion. This is the rostral commissure. And as you see, the rostral cerebral artery is that one. It forms several branches, and there are anastomoses in between those branches. So the rostral cerebral artery, as you see, vascularizes 2/3 of the middle aspect of the cerebral hemispheres. So we proceed with these arteries, and now we are going to talk about the middle cerebral artery. And this is the middle cerebral artery. Okay, remember that the middle cerebral artery has branched off at the end of the internal carotid artery, or at the beginning of the rostral cerebral artery. So again, the oculomotor nerve going between the rostral cerebella and the Caudal Cerebral. So again, the middle cerebral artery. And as you see, this is the middle cerebral artery. What do we identify as well here are all part of the caudal communicating artery. Okay, and as you see, the middle cerebral artery has a sigmoid shape. Here it is this, right. And also we identify, but in this case, on the other side, the internal ophthalmic artery. Remember that this artery, the internal ophthalmic artery, runs in close contact with the optic nerve. So this is a lateral view of the encephalon of a dog, and you see the middle cerebral artery ramifying on the lateral aspect, most of the lateral aspect of the cerebrum. You see, everything here should be vascularized by the middle cerebral artery. Okay, transverse section on MRI. Okay, here you have the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri and branches from these are in particular branches from the middle cerebral artery. So as you see cases, we may found that in this case, this is a hyperintense signal affecting the coated nucleus, white matter in between this coated nucleus and lentiform nucleus. And is a slight hyperintense after contrast. Or in this case, was a lesion of the middle cerebral artery, because the middle cerebral artery supplies the basal nuclei. Or in this case, an infarct, this is the sign of the edema of the middle cerebral artery. So, as we are talking about this middle cerebral artery, we have to identify some of the arteries that are very important, are going to vascularize the basal nuclei. Again, in this left image, we see the internal carotid artery running ventral to the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri and lateral to the hypophysis, right? So this here we have the internal carotid artery, more dorsally the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri, and this branch here correspond at this level as the middle cerebral artery. Because, as you see, this middle cerebral artery branches off at the level of the press sphenoid bone. Here we have the press sphenoid bone. Here we have the basal sphenoid bone. Okay? And again, the middle cerebral artery on a dissection. Okay? So, as if we see that, the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri, right here, we are going to find the hypophysis, right? This is the paracellar region that contains the internal carotid artery, and dorsally, these arteries here are arteries that have branch off from the end of the internal carotid artery are going to form the middle cerebral artery. We are at this level here. Now, these are these arteries. Here we have the striated arteries. As you see, the middle cerebral artery divides in two big branches. Okay, and the rostral branch of the middle cerebral artery branches off the striated arteries. These are arteries that go up, and they are going to vascularize the basal nuclei. These are these signals here. We can also see them on MRIs. Okay, and on these sections, you see, this is the middle cerebral artery, the piriform lobe. Here we are at this level, the piriform lobe, the olfactory bulb, olfactory peduncle, olfactory bulb, right? Lateral rhinal sulcus, right? And so at this level, we see all these small arteries penetrating the cerebrum at the perforate substance, right? Here. So these are the striated arteries, okay? These are arteries that branch off from the rostral branch of the middle cerebral artery. And also we can identify them on the dissections. These ones here. Here I have cut part of the cerebral hemispheres and I left a slice of the cerebral hemisphere. And as you see from the middle cerebral artery, these arteries that branch off. and also you see them here. Okay, this is a very, very nice paper from these guys, in which they show the striated arteries. So the next artery is coming from the caudal communicating artery, is the caudal cerebral artery. Okay. Okay, remember that this is part of the Circulus Arteriosus Cerebri, and the part that runs from the internal carotid artery up to the basilar artery is the caudal communicating artery. So now we see the Circulus Arteriosus Cerebri very close to the hypophysis, and this artery here, this black spot that goes up, this is at the level of the mesothalamus, right? Mesothalamus, we are beginning to cut the cerebral peduncles right here, and this black dot here that runs lateral to the cerebral peduncles, and at this place, right, slightly ventral from the mesothalamus. This is the lateral geniculate. This is the lateral geniculate nucleus or corpus, right, from the mesothalamus. So we have here the caudal cerebral artery. So we are cutting at this level here. This is the caudal communicating artery. And so we have the caudal cerebral artery and a big caudally, the rostral cerebellar. Okay. So again, we are focusing in this area. And in a close-up, we have the caudal cerebral and the rostral cerebellar, both branches from the caudal communicating artery. Okay. So we start dissection, and we see the caudal cerebral artery as it goes, and it comes in close contact between the optic tract, the medial geniculate nucleus or body, and the lateral geniculate body here. Okay. And this one here is the rostral cerebellar. We see the basilar artery underneath. Okay. And if we look carefully at the basilar artery, we identify at the level of the pons, pontine branches, pontine arteries, then a labyrinthine artery, and the caudal cerebellar. Look how far from the Circulus Arteriosus Cerebri is branching off the caudal cerebellar artery. Okay, so dissection again, we see the caudal cerebral artery that branches in two big arteries. One that is running between the middle, or no, the middle geniculate body, right, and the optic tract. And as it passes, but the middle geniculate body is related with the lateral geniculate body, right? This branch of the caudal cerebral artery, and the other one, it's running in contact with the these portions here are the cerebral peduncles. So, and it's running close contact with the cerebral peduncles and running caudal to the middle geniculate body. Okay, and this is the rostral cerebellar artery. So when we look at these sections, we see the mesothalamus with the middle geniculate body, the lateral geniculate body with the parts of the internal capsule that projects from the lateral geniculate body to the occipital cortex, that is the optic radiation. So, and ventral, at this level, ventral to the middle geniculate body and lateral to the cerebral peduncles, we find the caudal cerebral artery, one of the branches, okay? One of the branches. And this branch should be this one, okay? This one. And when we cut a bit up, very close to the lateral geniculate body, we should be cutting another branch of the caudal cerebral artery, that is this one here. So here we have cut the caudal cerebral artery at 2 points, okay, or 2 branches of this caudal cerebral artery, okay? Important. This one should be this one, and this one is this one here. So the caudal cerebral artery vascularizes the occipital cortex. Okay, again, we focus on this region. Here we have sectioned at the level of the mesencephalon. We see the hippocampus here, the lateral ventricles, the cingulate gyrus, okay, and the mesencephalon. This belongs to the mesothalamus, okay, the lateral and medial geniculate bodies. So at this level, we were cutting the caudal cerebral artery. And as you see, this artery is running, as you see, this form of the artery, What do we have here? Again, the mesencephalon with the mesencephalic aqueduct, the rostral colliculi. And here we have the mesothalamus. So as you see, this artery is going on the external aspect of the medial geniculate body, and then it is related also a bit caudally to the lateral geniculate body. So this is the caudal cerebral artery that's running up. Okay, remember here, this caudal cerebral artery, these two arteries, and this one is the one that makes this big loop. Okay, this is the caudal cerebral artery, one of the branches. Again, it is important to notice here the caudal cerebral artery, the two branches of the caudal cerebral artery, and the relation with the cerebral peduncles, the optic tract here, the middle geniculate body, and a bit up the lateral geniculate body here. As you see, when it reaches the middle geniculate body, the caudal cerebral artery is running caudal and in close contact with the optic tract. Here we have the lateral geniculate body. And this caudal branch of the caudal cerebral artery extends and ramifies on the dorsolateral aspect of the mesencephalon. So here, okay. And this is the Rostral Cerebellar artery. Okay, and here I have also marked the caudal cerebral artery, because the caudal cerebral artery then goes caudal to the splenium of the corpus callosum and anastomosis with the rostral cerebral artery on top of the body of the corpus callosum. Let's have a look at this video. Okay, we identify the hypophysis, the optic chiasm, the optic nerves, the internal carotid arteries, and the caudal communicating arteries on both sides, the basilar artery. Okay, and as you see, I'm marking the caudal communicating artery and the basilar artery. Okay, and there we have the rostral cerebellar. Okay, again, this is the caudal cerebral artery and the rostral cerebellar artery. Okay, again, the caudal cerebral artery. And look the relation. It passes lateral to the cerebral peduncles and then continues between the optic tract, the middle geniculate body. Goes up and related with the lateral geniculate body. And here, the rostral cerebellar artery. Okay. As you see, the rostral cerebellar artery that is running with the trochlear nerve. The basilar artery. So remember here, when the basilar artery meets the ventral spinal artery, this forms a rhombus-like structure. So we have the C1 here at the level. We are at the level of C1, C2. Okay, here I have marked the pontine artery. Sorry, again. Okay, this is the pontine artery, the labyrinthine artery, and the caudal cerebellar artery. And as you see, the caudal cerebellar artery, it goes on top of the caudal cerebellar peduncle and related with these. These are the extension, this is the extension of the choroidal plexuses of the fourth ventricle through the lateral openings of the fourth ventricle. Okay. We also can go back and start, sorry about this video, It's a very tricky video. Okay, this is I want you to show. What you see here is the choroidal plexuses of the fourth ventricle, these two rows that are parallel and very close. This is at the level of the obex. And these are the extensions of the choroidal plexuses of the fourth ventricle through the lateral openings of the fourth ventricle. Here you have the choroidal plexuses of the fourth ventricle. And here is the Caudal cerebellar artery. As you see, it's a branch of the basilar artery that goes on top of the caudal cerebellar peduncle and then goes dorsally to vascularize the caudal portion of the cerebellum. And it also supplies the choroidal plexuses of the fourth ventricle. You see the choroidal plexuses of the fourth ventricle. The blood to the choroidal plexuses of the fourth ventricle comes from the caudal cerebellar artery. Yeah, okay. Now we can jump. This is a transverse section at the level of the pons. As you see, the transverse fibers of the pons, pontine nuclei, right, are scattered here at the longitudinal fibers of the pons that form the corticopontine tract and the corticospinal tract. Okay, dorsally we have the fourth ventricle, and on top of the fourth ventricle, the caudal medullary velum and the vermis of the cerebellum and cerebellar hemispheres. Here, marked in with yellow arrows, is the Rostral Cerebellar artery, and as you see, there are connections between both sides of these arteries. Again, this ventrolateral view shows up the cerebellum here, the pons, the medulla oblongata, and the basilar artery. Here we have the labyrinthine artery that goes up. We will study this artery a bit later. Okay, we have the trigeminal nerve, the facial and vestibulocochlear nerve. And you see the choroidal plexuses of the fourth ventricle. This is the extension in the subarachnoid space, okay? The extension of these choroidal plexuses through the lateral openings of the fourth ventricle. And now we focus on the caudal cerebellar artery. Is this one? Sometimes it has a sigmoid shape. Sometimes it's more straight. And as you see, it goes on top of the caudal cerebellar peduncle. Again, goes on top. This is important to notice, the choroidal plexuses of the fourth ventricle. And then you have the dorsal paraflocculus, the ventral paraflocculus, and the flocculus located at this level. You see the flocculus. And this is important because as we identify the labyrinthine artery goes up here and vascularizes the labyrinth in the ear, okay? Goes to vascularize the structures that are in the inner ear, right? However, I think that these labyrinthine arteries, as it goes very in close contact with the flocculus, it may provide arterial supply to the flocculus. This is a caudal view with the vermis of the cerebellum, okay? In this case, we will have the pyramid, the paramedian lobule, the dorsal paraflocculus, ventral paraflocculus, and the unciform lobule here. So the caudal cerebellar peduncle here, and the other one, and these are the choroidal plexuses, these two rows here, and the extensions of the choroidal plexuses. And here we mark the caudal cerebellar artery. As it goes up, goes over the caudal cerebellar peduncle, and then starts to vascularize the caudal portion of the cerebellum, and in particular, this caudal portions of the vermis, the uvula and the nodulus. And it also supplies blood, as you see, supplies blood to the choroidal plexuses of the fourth ventricle. So this caudal cerebellar artery is here, and we have moved the cerebellum rostrally in order to identify the lingula here, and the nodulus and the uvula, okay? And as you see, all these branches that branch off from the caudal cerebellar artery and are entering the nodulus, all right? And also the rest of the portions of the cerebellum, okay? And also these branches that vascularize the choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle. On MRIs, this is a midplane section. You see the choroidal plexuses or choroid plexuses of the fourth ventricle here. In the fourth ventricle, here we have the rostral medullary velum, caudal medullary velum, and the telachoroidea of the fourth ventricle. And a transverse section, we identify the choroidal plexuses, these two rows that we have identified before. Let's go and identify them. These two ones, okay? And the extension through the lateral openings of the fourth ventricle into the supraarachnoid space. And again, a close-up, a section that is a bit more caudal. We have the choroidal plexuses of the fourth ventricle. And if we compare it, as you see, if you compare it with the image, as more caudally progress, that we just see the two rows. But in this image here was taken at this level, okay? So we can see the projections of the choroidal plexuses of the fourth ventricle through the lateral openings of the fourth ventricle inside the supraarachnoid space. Let's have a look at another video. The oculomotor nerve, the caudal cerebral, the rostral cerebellar, okay? And as you see, the caudal cerebral artery, again, with two branches, one that is very big and runs lateral to the cerebral peduncles and runs then in between the middle geniculate body and the optic tract. These branches here belong to the caudal branch of the caudal cerebral artery, and as you see, ramifies on top of the mesencephalon. Look at the relation between the optic tract, lateral geniculate body, and then on top and laterally we have the caudal cerebral artery, the first branch. And also it's going to continue here. This is the continuation of the caudal cerebral artery that was vascularizing the cerebral hemisphere that has been removed, okay? And then on this, I am marking with the forceps the caudal cerebral artery of the right side that runs on top of the corpus callosum in order to join the rostral cerebral artery. Okay, and what's going to happen in the cat? Very similar. In this image, I think is a very, very nice image from this book. We have the basilar artery and as you see, then a common branch from the basilar artery splits in the labyrinthine artery and in the caudal cerebellar artery. So in the cat, the caudal cerebellar artery is also a branch indirectly from the basilar artery. This is important to remember. Again, we have the choroidal plexuses of the fourth ventricle and the caudal cerebellar artery, that branches off far caudally in the basilar artery, okay? Again, in the cat, you have here again the oculomotor nerve, the rostral cerebellar, and the Caudal Cerebral Artery. Again, the Caudal Cerebral Artery and the Rostral Cerebellar, and in between the Oculomotor Nerve. And it's going to be pretty similar, the Caudal Cerebral Artery and the Rostral Cerebellar Artery. Okay, again, this is a nice image because here we can identify the Rostral Cerebellar running in close contact with the trochlear nerve. This is the caudal colliculus of the mesencephalon, the vermis of the cerebellum, right here. So this makes us a point. Why dogs are more prone to suffer vascular lesions affecting the rostral cerebellar artery. And there is a theory. Here is a diagram of the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri and the basilar artery. In the case of the dog, the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri receives blood from the internal carotid arteries and the basilar artery. And from this point, the point of joining the caudal communicating artery, both with the basilar artery, you see branches of at this level the rostral cerebellar artery. So here may be slightly, or maybe these animals are prone to have turbulences that may alter the flowing of the blood in this area. So, and the most proximal artery here is the rostral cerebellar. However, in the cat, the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri receives blood from the internal carotid arteries. The basilar artery takes blood away from the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri. So maybe these animals are not so prone to have alterations of the blood flow at this level here. And as you have seen, the rostral cerebellar artery and the caudal cerebellar arteries branch off from very similar sites as in the dog. So now we have to talk about the arteries supplying the choroid plexuses. Okay, these choroid plexuses are arterially vascularized. So first we have the rostral choroid artery. The rostral choroid artery is going to give blood to the choroid plexuses of the lateral ventricle. This rostral choroid artery may be an artery from the middle cerebral artery or from the caudal communicating artery, it depends. Okay. In this case, we see the rostral choroid artery branching from the beginning of the middle cerebral artery. So a lesion at the middle cerebral artery, in this case, may affect vascularization of the choroid plexuses of the lateral ventricle. Here we have in the same animal the caudal cerebral artery that gives rise here, as you have seen before, okay, running with the medial geniculate body, optic tract, lateral geniculate body. So at this level branches the choroid plexus, the choroid artery, to the lateral choroid plexus. Now we have a video. After injecting Indian ink, we identify the, here, remember, what do we have here? The middle cerebral artery, okay? The caudal communicating artery of the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri. The caudal cerebral artery here. And here you see this small artery that runs together lateral to the optic tract, this one here, okay? This one here is the rostral choroid artery, and in this case is branching from the beginning of the caudal communicating artery. Here you have it. And we follow it. As you see, we follow it in close contact with the optic tract. Okay, lateral to the optic tract, goes up. Here. Do not, this is the rostral, sorry, this one here is the caudal cerebral artery that runs, remember, in between the middle geniculate body, the lateral geniculate body. So, and here, a bit more rostrally, we have the rostral choroid artery. It's going up here, lateral to the lateral geniculate body. We continue this artery, and as we see, we identify the choroidal plexuses of the third ventricle of the, well, the choroidal plexus. Of the lateral ventricle, sorry. Here is the caudal cerebral artery. Again, it runs between the lateral and medial geniculate bodies. And they go rostral. And in this case, this caudal cerebral artery is going to supply blood to the choroid plexuses of the third ventricle. So, these are the choroidal plexuses of the lateral ventricle, lateral. And the lateral ventricle receives arterial blood from the rostral choroid artery, while the choroid plexuses of the third ventricle receive blood from the caudal cerebral artery. You see there. Again, in this image, this you see is the caudate nucleus with the tail, the corpus callosum, right? The lateral geniculate body. And here we have, inside the lateral ventricle, the choroid plexus of the lateral ventricle that receives blood, this, from the rostral choroid artery, that in turn may be a branch of the middle cerebral artery or the caudal communicating artery. And here we have, marked with the forceps, the caudal cerebral artery that gives blood, takes blood to the choroid plexuses of the third ventricle. The choroid plexuses of the lateral ventricle, and here the caudal cerebral artery. Okay, and more. Here we have the lateral choroid plexus inside the lateral ventricle. This is the fornix, commissure of the fornix, caudate nucleus with its tail, lateral ventricle filled with choroid plexuses of the lateral ventricle that have received blood from the rostral choroid artery. Okay? Okay, this is the fornix and the caudate nucleus. And now we see this is the choroid plexus of the third ventricle that receives blood from the caudal cerebral artery. Okay, the first branch of the caudal cerebral artery. Okay, the choroid plexuses of the third ventricle. Okay, and again to remember that, okay, important, the rostral choroid artery here that runs lateral to the optic tract, and the first branch of the caudal cerebral artery here that runs between the middle geniculate body and the lateral geniculate body, and this is the one responsible for the arterial blood supply to the choroid plexuses of the of the third ventricle, while the lateral plexuses of the choroid plexuses of the lateral ventricle is supplied by the rostral choroid artery. Okay, so here is marked here the rostral choroid artery that is surrounded by choroid plexus of the lateral ventricle. So remember these structures, okay? Choroid plexuses of the lateral, choroid plexuses of the third. Okay, now we are going to make a transverse section at this level, and we see the corpus callosum, the fornix, right? The lateral ventricles, and the, well, we'll talk about later about that. The third ventricle ends here. Okay, this is not a ventricle in particular, but we'll talk later on. So, and then we focus here. And when we focus on the lateral ventricle, we see the tail of the caudate nucleus and the choroid plexuses of the lateral ventricle with a big artery, the rostral choroid artery branch of the beginning of the caudal communicating artery or at the beginning of the middle cerebral artery. It depends, okay? So, summarizing, what do we have? Rostral choroid artery, caudal choroid artery, and choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle. Okay, the first, the rostral choroid artery supplies the lateral ventricle, and this artery is a branch of the middle cerebral artery or the caudal communicating artery. The caudal choroid artery supplies the third ventricle, okay? And it's a branch of the caudal cerebral artery. And finally, the choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle, and the artery that supplies this plexus is the Caudal Cerebellar Artery. Caudal Cerebellar Artery. Okay, having said that, we are going to talk about the hypophyseal arteries. Okay, this encephalon has been injected with Indian ink, and what do we see? We see the adenohypophysis, the optic chiasm, the optic nerves, right? The oculomotor, this is the peripheral lobe here, right? So, again, these vertical vessels correspond to the internal carotid arteries, right? Okay. And in one of them, as you see, the internal ophthalmic artery is detaching from this internal carotid artery in order to run lateral to the optic nerve. Okay, we began the dissections, we elevate the hypophysis, right? And we identify clearly the caudal communicating artery, right? That is running from the internal carotid artery up to the basilar artery. As we pull the hypophysis, right, we see a lot of vessels that are entering at the level of the neurohypophysis. Here is the neurohypophysis. Then we have the tuber cinereum, okay? The pituitary stalk has been broken now, section here, and this portion here is the neurohypophysis. Look how very well vascularized is the neurohypophysis if we compare it with the adenohypophysis that surrounds the first, okay? So again, caudal communicating artery, and then what we add a rostral intercarotid artery, okay? And then we start to see something. Look at this. The caudal intercarotid artery is a circle, okay, that is inside the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri, okay? This is the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri, and inside we have a circle formed by the caudal intercarotid artery, okay? Caudal, and branches from this caudal intercarotid artery will vascularize the hypophysis. In a close-up, the rostral internal carotid artery also branches from it, will vascularize the hypophysis. Of course, as we have sectioned the pituitary stalk, we see the third ventricle through the infundibulum, okay? So, and now, as we are pulling these caudal communicating arteries, we start to see small arteries entering and vascularizing the thalamus and hypothalamic nuclei. Okay? And again, the caudal communicating artery, and this artery that is coming from the internal carotid artery is the caudal intercarotid artery. As you see, it runs very close to the border of the hypophysis and is responsible for vascularization of the hypophysis. Okay, and again in this image, as we pull the caudal communicating artery, we identify all these small vessels entering the thalamus and hypothalamus. Okay, and again the same. Okay, and again you see the same. The hypophysis is moved, and as you see, this is the rostral hypophyseal artery. Okay, rostral hypophyseal artery that goes to vascularize the hypophysis. So remember that we have a caudal intercarotid artery and a rostral intercarotid artery. Okay, and from there are going to be hypophyseal arteries that are going to vascularize the hypophysis. Again, you see, this is the caudal communicating artery and the caudal intercarotid artery. And all these vessels that supply the caudal intercarotid artery, right, also, and they also supply thalamic and hypothalamic structures. Again, more of these vessels coming from the caudal communicating artery. And finally, a video where you will see the hypophysis here, the internal carotid arteries, and then we see the caudal intercarotid artery and the caudal communicating artery with all these branches entering thalamus and hypothalamus. Okay? And the caudal intercarotid artery that forms borders the hypophysis. Remember that the hypophysis is not surrounded by leptomeninges. However, all these vessels are inside the subarachnoid space. This is important to notice. So all these hypophyseal vessels, they have to enter, they cross the arachnoid in order to reach the hypophysis. Okay, now we have removed the hypophysis. We have the tuber cynerium. Here is the infundibulum, the internal carotid arteries. And here we have the caudal intercarotid artery and the caudal communicating artery of the Circulus Arteriosus cerebri. All these vessels in the subarachnoid space. However, the hypophysis is not surrounded by leptomeninges. And look all the small vessels that are branching from the caudal communicating artery, reaching the caudal intercarotid artery, and also reaching thalamic and hypothalamic structures. You see all these small vessels. This is the rostral intercarotid artery that is responsible to supply also the hypophysis. Okay, thank you very much.